plastic surgeon at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto. I also have an imaging lab in optical imaging, so I have a PhD. My focus is in tissue physiology and tissue viability, first coming out of the burn unit and burn physiology, now into chronic wounds and acute traumatic wounds. I'm going to talk to you about something that's really exciting. And if you guys were at the conversation that we had yesterday on innovation, I hope you're going to get excited too. And as I highlighted yesterday, if you weren't there, I think we have a real opportunity as wound care experts to be the leaders in the adoption of these new medical technologies. These technologies do currently exist in our environment, and I'm going to explain it to you. So this session is essentially going to be your introduction as advanced practice wound care people in the new technology that's about to come into our environment as the experts. So I'm going to give you basically the basics of wound diagnostics. Overall, I have some disclosures, and I've been upfront about these things from the beginning, as well as I was hired at the hospital in a unique situation. So my job is actually as a surgeon scientist. I have to translate technologies into the clinical environment. It's a part of my contract. So I am constantly trying to think of new ways to do things, but also thinking about first the medical problem and then creating the solution versus saying, hey, I have something cool, what can I apply it to? It's different. It's a different mindset. And it's been really fun because I get to work in a little bit of a different capacity as well. This is called iBest. It's a union between Ryerson University as well as St. Michael's Hospital. I have a similar, I'm in a similar incubator center that's associated with U of T at the Rutman Business School. Our objectives right now are really to define the term, or the umbrella term, wound diagnostics, introduce some novel tools to evaluate wound physiology and what's coming down the pipeline, and I really want to challenge the way we currently evaluate wound healing. Welcome to the future. So this, we've talked a lot, but this is really a talk of the future, because the things I'm going to describe to you aren't currently here, they're not in the market yet, but definitely are coming down the pipeline. We have to think to the future, because if you constantly stick in your own same space, we're doing the same things over and over again. Overall, if you think of what we do for wound measurement, how many times are you putting the Q-tips to look for the tunneling, taking our wound measuring guide, for an example, but how do you know you're getting the same measurement every single time? And why would we do this over and over again? We can automate this. The computers can actually do this for us very well and very quickly. This is physiology, not anatomy, and I just gave a burn talk where I sort of talked about the same thing. These are not layers. I guess they technically are, but you have to think about what's happening in the wound if you're going to change it. Overall, we haven't treated them like physiologic wounds because we just haven't had a way to do that non-invasively. And then, do we really understand what we're treating? So do you really understand what you're doing when you put wound care product X on that wound? Do we understand if that's the needs of the wound at that time? It's not our fault. We're experts in our field. It's just that we have no outcome measures other than a measuring tape. Our current outcome measure is a visual inspection. I would say everyone in this room is a lot better at it than a person who has no training in wound care. We look at wound healing time, so that could be a couple of weeks or it could be a couple of years. So that's an outcome measure that takes a long time. So how do you actually know if your intervention worked or not when you've probably changed it 10 times in the process of that wound healing? Which one actually worked to solve your problem? And then wound size, as we've already highlighted. Overall, what we really need in this environment is something that's portable. So you want to be able to put it in your pocket. It should be handheld, so quite simple, take a picture. It should be low cost. You want to be able to, everyone should be able to have one, as well. It should be integrated. What do I mean by that? It should be integrated into our health systems. So it's feedback not that you see on your phone, but that everyone can share. And I'm sure everyone in this group knows that when you go to look at a dressing, someone's probably changed that dressing 3 times because 3 different types of services are actually looking at it. This should be shared information where there's one picture, one person changing the dressing, and create more efficiency within our system. Again, this is highlighting some of the work that I did in my PhD. I'm a surgeon scientist, so in Toronto we actually come out of a residency, we do a full PhD, and then we kind of go back. This was translating near-infrared spectroscopy into the clinical environment. Again, it was a joint effort, and I worked with the National Research Council of Canada, and I currently still do. These models were burn models, so I also am a basic scientist, so I do animal work, although it really pains me sometimes, and I try not to if I don't have to, as well as clinical models. what does that give you? It gives you an objective measure. So if we know, so for example, I'm going to talk to you about burns first. If you have an objective measure of burn wound viability, so if a wound's going to heal or not heal, that gives you the opportunity to diagnose and manage early. You can improve your patient outcome. As we just talked about in the last session, if you don't diagnose these people properly and you leave them for a couple weeks before you operate on them, they have poor functional outcomes and sometimes poor mortality outcomes. This also gives us insight. It gives us insight into that novel physiology or that zone of stasis that we're trying to change, and it allows us to develop novel therapeutics. Now you have targeted therapy. This is really challenging though, so this isn't easy. I'm going to talk to you today about how simple this is. This has not been simple. I've been doing this for 15 years. My collaborator has also been doing it for the same amount of time. I'm sometimes a fish out of water, and at first when I started talking about this in the burn area or in burn meetings, sometimes people would be like, yeah, you mean my 30 years of experience is better than your technology? And it's like, yeah, but we got to change our mindset. So this is a mindset switch. And it can be challenging too because the wounds are changing, and so you have to be able to monitor them very quickly so they're progressive and dynamic. Again, getting back to that introduction, again, we are the right group to test these technologies because we have the most experience in skin. What is an optical technology? An optical technology is essentially an umbrella term for a lot of stuff, and it's a lot of complicated math, and I'm going to try to keep it simple. It's really just looking at light. So it's electromagnetic radiation, Greek photos meaning light, and we look at how it's emitted, transmitted, amplified, detected, or modulated. So another word, you're using the word modulation again. It's already in the hospital. So your SAT probe is essentially a fancy optical device. Your digital camera is an optical device, except it's using white light. We have other technologies that we use. Does anyone know what a coaximeter is? When you send your blood down to the lab, essentially is a fancy optical device. Again, looking at light. For me, my light of interest is in the near infrared region, and this is great light because it penetrates deep into the tissue and it can tell you a lot of novel things. This isn't something that we just came up with, so it's not something that just showed up in medicine. It actually came out of NASA as well as the art world. So the artists actually did this quite well. I'm going to show you a painting. This is Filipino Lippi's painting, The Adoration of the Magi, of which the art community felt that it was originally painted by Leonardo da Vinci, but they couldn't scrape off the painting to see what was underneath. They used near-infrared techniques or optical techniques to scan the image, and sure enough, the Leonardo painting was underneath. So this is translational stuff that we're just bringing over into the realm of medicine. The optical properties of tissue, again, let's just quickly and superficially go over a little math. If you shine light onto the skin or you shine light onto tissue, depending on what it does, so if it scatters, if it absorbs, we can detect it, and based on how it's changed, we can tell what's happening in the tissue. This is actually quite cool, and you don't have to touch the tissue at all. Overall, I'm going to organize the talk now into where these optical technologies are applying into things that we care about. So like bacteria, perfusion, oxygenation, so that's how we're going to do it. The first way is with white light, so your digital camera. We have wound measurement apps now, and there's a lot of technologies out there that are on your phone or within prospective data banks where you can take a picture, they can tell you the size. Some of them are currently looking at tunneling. This is all going to be available to us. In fact, it's currently available to us right now with white light. So this is optical technology number one. It doesn't give you the physiology, but it's giving you the anatomy. Perfusion and oxygenation. Some of these technologies have been around for a long time, mainly in the burn world and in reconstruction, but just moving into our area. The first is laser Doppler. So laser Doppler is essentially looking at flux. It's looking how hemoglobin is moving through your blood vessels. And based on the movement, they can tell if the area is perfused or not. So this is showing a child that has a burn that's going to heal. So the red means it's going to heal and it's well perfused. Popular technology around for about 20, 25 years, mainly used in the burn scenario. You can also inject a dye. So if you inject a dye into someone and you excite it with a laser, you can also tell if something is perfused. This again is looking at anatomy. So does it have blood flow? These types of technologies are mainly used in reconstruction. So I do a lot of breast reconstruction. We inject it into the mastectomy flap to determine if the mastectomy flap will live or die and if I should do my reconstruction. The problem with this is that you do have to inject a dye, so there's cost, as well as it really just gives you sort of the anatomy of the perfusion versus is the perfusion actually doing anything. And we can talk about that one a little bit later. Spectroscopy. Now this is a heavy word. It's a big word. There's lots of different ways we describe it. In fact, the physicists and mathematicians will all fight over what these technologies are. There's terms like hyperspectral imaging, multispectral imaging, near-infrared spectroscopy, which I just showed you, diffuse reflectance spectroscopy. Doesn't matter. Probably not for a group that's trialing the technology, but for someone like me, it'd be important because it tells me how the technology works. But just remember spectroscopy if you can, or optical imaging for these types of technologies. What can we do here? We can measure oxyhemoglobin, deoxyhemoglobin, water, or edema. That translates to perfusion, oxygenation, edema, how oxygen is being utilized in the mitochondria, so cellular oxygenation, bacteria, and free radicals. These are all important factors for wound healing. I'm going to give you some examples. This is from near-infrared spectroscopy, again from my lab. This is a porcine burn model looking at pre-burn closest to me, 10 minutes after injury to the other side. The pink line, everything below is going to heal. Everything above is not going to heal. You can see right away, 10 minutes after injury, we can tell what's healing and what's not. These are clinical results that you would get 5 to 7 days after you put the burns on the dorsum of this animal. Looking at pedicled skin flaps, I'm going to show you human stuff. Just stick with me for a second. This is pre-op and post-op. So if you look at the digital image, so the 1 hour, 12 hour, and 72 hours, that's with a digital camera. This is a flap that we literally lift up. There's blood vessels. We put some clamps on it, leave it there for 30 minutes, let the clamps go. It's a predictive model of ischemia. You can see that at 1 hour, so you see the grayscale image that's on the end, at 1 hour you can see the part that's closest to those blood vessels is going to be fine, but the rest of the flap is dead, and we don't see those results until 72 hours after injury clinically. So this is predictive tissue viability monitor. Let's look at this very quickly in a burn. I put a simple example up for you right now. So we have a central area of necrosis, a surrounding area of erythema, and it's nicely outlined in oxygen saturation. You can see that central wound is dead quite simply. And if you look at the perfusion or total hemoglobin, again, it's dead, outlining nicely that area of hyperemia or perfusion. So it's a quick example of how these technologies work. How does this apply to diabetic foot ulcers? Well, I'm not the only person looking in this area. There are a couple groups, mainly in America. This is a diabetic foot ulcer. So this is using a little bit of a different technology, but very similar, highlighting that central area of necrosis. The red is the surrounding sort of reperfusion, but essentially this ends up being a non-healing wound. So it's a quick and simple near-infrared image to show you that it's not going to heal. I think most of us could tell that, but this is just an example of what it can do. Edema. Again, if you've been in the burn talk, I'm going to show you a pretty big picture. This is an 85-pound, 55-year-old Asian woman. Most people think it's a small child. They get very large in the first 48 to 72 hours after injury, so massive edema. It affects that zone of stasis, so that's your critical zone that you don't want to convert into the zone of necrosis. They have increased infection risk if you're this swollen, systemic hypovolemia, so they lose their blood pressure, fluid creep, so these are things where you have to do laparotomies because their intestines are under so much pressure that they need to expand. Same on the limb, you're actually opening up the limb to allow blood flow to go to the hand. This is a really big problem, especially in burns, but also in critical care. It's called fluid creep, and we don't really know how to resuscitate these patients or when should we add colloids or other medications to combat the edema. Near-infrared technology or spectroscopy can actually help with this in terms of those endpoints. So for example, we can actually measure water. Well, think about what we can do now for chronic wounds if we can actually measure edema. So now you know if your therapies are actually working properly or not. So let me just walk you through this. This is a very, very superficial burn. And you can see that in the middle picture. Do you see how it's white? It's more white. That means it's more water. The little dots that you have on the side are just registration markers. It's actually a Sharpie pen, so we're measuring the same site every time. The control site shows hardly any water at all. So there's definitely something happening in that wound, so there's more edema. In fact, that wound, when you took off the dressing, was weeping. It would drip to the floor. So we have a great way now of measuring water as a surrogate marker of edema. Now you have an outcome measure for your compression, for the treatments that we might help people who have lymphedema, or whether it's acquired or congenital. Finally, then getting back into bacteria or infection. Again, yesterday I presented the fact that thermography was the early entry of optical technologies into wound care, but I would argue that it's not the right device. But I'm really happy it's in, and I'm really happy that we're starting to talk about these things. But overall, if you look at, this is probably the best study looking at thermography. They had 332 patients. It was a randomized controlled trial. 89 centers were involved in the study, but there was no correlation between skin temperature and poor clinical outcome. There's a trend towards larger temperature differentials for the poor outcome, but there's a reason for that. And I did these studies as well in my PhD. If you change the environmental temperature, you can change the temperature of the foot. We actually did it as a little bit of a test to show the students yesterday or a couple days ago before I came down. If I rub my hand on my leg and then I put it under the thermographer, I could change the temperature of my hand. The reality is these are really sensitive to environmental temperatures or what you've done or manipulated to the skin. So I would say don't stop using it if you currently use it and you like it, but there are better things now currently coming down the pipeline, so hold on. As well as, I think there's been some talks here as well looking at UV or just into the near infrared region for bacteria. So we can actually measure whether there's bacteria in the wound or not. Now this is also a little bit dubious in the sense that yes, you can measure bacteria, but as you're about to hear from Dr. Perry, what does that mean? So the fact that we know there's bacteria in the wound, it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. But again, I'm really excited to see that people are trying to use these technologies to monitor what's happening in the wound. And then finally, just looking to you to imagine. So this is the future. This is not a talk where I can say, hey, here's your technology for this or this. But we are not that far off from bringing this to you. There's a lot of people working in this area. It's an exciting area to be in for me. It's also really somewhat incorporated into our environment right now, but it is definitely the way of the future. We currently have built these technologies from 15 feet tall into small devices that could fit into your pocket, mainly because of computing power and the power of the cell phone. So if you think of your cell phone, we use it for everything. It's just really changing the light that's currently in there and a bit of math at this point. Overall, I hope it was somewhat interesting for you, maybe exciting. Exciting, yes, I think it's exciting, mainly because I've spent 15 years of my life in it. And if you have questions, please, I'm on social media. We update what's happening in this tech area all the time on Twitter and Facebook. Obviously, I'm a scientist, so why would I do that? But I think it's really important to disseminate information and get feedback and collaborations with groups who may be interested in trialing the technologies. That's it. I'll open up for questions. Any questions?
Hold that up. You don't seem to have a moderator, so I can moderate.
Yeah, please moderate.
I'm just going to ask you a question. I mean, some of the technology that you're showing, particularly the near-infrared spectroscopy, really look very interesting. You know, we measure various elements of edema and some of the diffusion. I mean, how far away do you think that is in terms of being used in chronic wounds? Where clearly some of those things are useful to measure, but I guess what we need to know is, if we measure it, is it something we can do that will then influence outcomes? So, I mean, how far do you think it is from really being built into a treatment paradigm for chronic wounds?
I would say most of these technologies are right now currently in clinical trials, so they're being trialed in that environment. How it impacts our outcome is, I guess that's what we're trying to do. So we're hoping, at least for the diabetic lower extremity, to try to prevent amputations with the vision that a patient would have this device in their home and be monitoring their feet essentially on their own. If they run into trouble or they see a change in their tissue viability, it would alert them to either seek medical advice or come to the hospital. Because currently right now, and we've talked about it all day, they don't monitor their feet that well. And so the first early trials are really in the diabetic lower extremity before they're in pressure. There's not a lot of people in pressure wounds, to be honest.
Yeah. Anyone else in the audience got any other questions for Dr. Cross? But I think it's an interesting area that you point to, really, that self-management piece, because that's an area where in many different parts of medicine are moving towards that. So the patients have got tools where they can monitor things themselves. And I guess one has to build into it then what they do if they find something.
Right, and it allows us to finally have data. Like, part of our problem is that we have no objective way of tracking these people over time. If you have physiologic information, so you know about their oxygenation, their perfusion, we have a couple other variables that are tissue viability markers. If you can follow them over time and you know what interventions they've had, you can see what changed. So now we have a rich environment to study, which we've never had before. We've never had the capacity to do that. They have to come to you to measure their wound. Now you can actually have it in real time in their house. It's being fed back into a system where we can actually monitor them over time. I think it's really cool. I think it's really cool. Yeah.
We've got a question, yes.
Just a quick question. I'm excited about what you're presenting here. It's really, really interesting. One of the big barriers, of course, in hospital-based settings is the issue of privacy. And when we bring in other technologies, of course, privacy officer will come along and say, how are you protecting confidentiality of the data? And one of the things that I've discovered is the amazing role of selfies, so using the patient's own handheld to take photographs, for example. It's one way we sort of get around that. But I just wonder, do you have any ideas of how we may be able to combat this, to work with this issue?
Right, yeah, okay, so this is actually really complicated. In fact, most of the reasons why these technologies can't get to point X where you can put it into a patient's hand is exactly for that reason. How do you get around the PIOPED and the PHIPAA laws? We have a group that we work with who's actually already fully integrated in e-mobile systems in the healthcare environment in Canada and the US. So they've developed the background. We have developed the mathematical algorithms, but they're actually doing the translational piece. They're fully integrated. They have servers in all the hospitals, at least in Toronto. They have servers in the US. And they've spent 5 to 6 years really in regulation around the privacy piece. So we're fully protected that way. And we went with a professional group to develop that software piece. Yeah, but you have to work with a group of people to get through the regulatory. It's 5 to 6 years for any type of e-mobile technology if you're doing it on your own.
Yeah.
So you were talking in the previous session about this funny protein that you found, protein whatever. And when Mike was talking about what to do with this information, I'm really super keen on having a tool that when we do debridement, most of us do it on our field. What we look at it, but we don't really know what we're doing. You go in there and you have a feel for the knife, you have a feel for the curette, you have a notion of color, but you really don't exactly know what you're doing, what you're taking off, and the big proponents of meticulous debridement, like Chris Attinger down in Georgetown, he's a freak about he takes biopsies and some crazy stuff. But the idea of being meticulous about the debridement to get a perfect debridement is something that really intrigues me, because then you're perfectly set, you perfectly reset that wound. And so when you mentioned this protein that you found, that's really intriguing for me to be able to translate that into, I know you got this device as well, that you can actually shine it or look at the wound and say, all of that needs to be debrided. You got to take it all out. When it's all gone, you're good to go. Is that what you're working on?
Yeah, a little bit. Yes, for sure. It definitely is a marker of tissue viability, so it could tell you how far to cut back. But I think you're actually about to hear a talk that's even probably more important than that for the debridement piece on why we have those issues by Dr. Julie Perry. She's going to blow your mind, so everyone should stay around. This actual tissue viability marker is really important in a predictive way. So if we saw it early in the burn injury, within 12 hours after injury, we knew at 5 to 7 days that wound was going to change into deep partial thickness or a full thickness injury. We're still looking at it in diabetic foot ulcers, but it actually was used as a predictive molecule in stroke. So if you had this molecule in your carotid artery, 33% of the time those patients went on to a stroke in the first year after seeing the molecule. And these are big studies, like thousands and thousands of patients. It's actually with my collaborator, Dr. Lung, who's an expert in this particular area as well. And we've just translated the work in the burns as well as stroke into the diabetic lower extremity. So it's predictive in burns and it's predictive in stroke. So we're thinking that it could be fairly predictive.
What's it called again?
Yeah, so I'm not going to tell you yet. We're going to call it Molecule M.
time
It's a
period, yeah.
secret molecule. Yeah.
Well, I think we're just about
Yeah,
at time,
good,
so
yeah.
thank you very much,
Yeah.
Karen, for coming.